Just to continue, or at least to contextualize where we are, so that we know where we're going today. We left off last time. One of the things that we learned was that Da'as, because remember, we're talking about the three stages, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'as, which are such an integral part of the development of the 10 Sephiros. So, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'as, we said Da'as is where a person makes the information personal. So to use an example, because we're going to keep coming back to this, remember there's two things we're going to keep coming back to. The one is the comparison between the human experience of these 10 attributes and the divine method of the 10 Sephiros. We're going to keep coming back to that. The other thing that we have to keep coming back to is, even when we're talking about the human experience, we have to talk about how it fits into our relationship with Hashem. It's no use coming to a shiur where all we're going to do is look at the mechanisms of the human experience. That's not good enough. It has to link back to a relationship with Hashem. So, the example that we used last week was, when a person has bina, when they have real understanding about Hashem, I'm not talking about Torah generally, I'm talking specifically knowledge and awareness of Hashem. So when a person has bina, when a person has understanding about Hashem, the net result of that understanding is kirvas Elokim toiv. That to be close to Hashem, that's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's a good thing to be close to Hashem. Empirically, objectively, conceptually. Da'as is like the verse that King David uses, says, Kirvas Elokim li toiv. It's not some objective, disembodied idea that it's good to have a relationship with Hashem. Li toiv. Relationship with Hashem is good for me. It's personal. So that was a really important thing that we spoke about last week, is the idea that when a person has da'as, that is when the person is in a state of personal connection to the information, to the concept that they have learned. Even if they've learned it very thoroughly beforehand, this is the transition where it becomes personal. Now, the first time that we encountered the idea, not the word, but the idea of what da'as is all about, is in the intimacy between Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. Because there the Torah tells us, Ve'ha-Adam, the original, so to speak, prototype man, Yoda es Chava Ishto. He knew Chava, Eve, his wife. And we understand that that is euphemistic. It doesn't mean that he knew her, because let's be honest, people are married for many, many years, they still don't know their spouses. So what does it mean, Yoda? It's a euphemism for the fact that they were intimate. In other words, that's given us a very important insight that what Da'as does and what Da'as is all about is union, connection, bringing things together. So that's why it makes sense when we talk about the idea that Da'as is the translation of objective information into personalized information. Li toiv. It's now connecting the idea to me. Right? That's what Da'as does. Connects information that I previously encountered in a very objective, theoretical way, connects it to me, it becomes mine. Okay, that's what we got up to last week. And one other thing that we spoke about last week, which is relevant today, is that the Gemara tells us, Ein oni ela b'da'as, ve'ein osher ela b'da'as, that there's no such thing as a poor person except in da'as, and there's no such thing as a wealthy person except in da'as. In other words, the poorest people are those who lack da'as. The wealthiest people are those who have mature da'as. Now that we understand that da'as is the integration of a concept, the personalization of a concept, where it is no longer book information, but it's actually my information, where the Gemara uses the expression HaTorah nikres al shemoi, where the Torah is actually named after the person. Think about it. You open up the Gemara, for example, and you hear certain things. Rabbi so-and-so said this, Rabbi so-and-so said that. Surely we shouldn't be concerned with what each rabbi said, we should be concerned with what God says. In fact, some people don't like this about Judaism. They say, we've got to look in the scriptures, right? To see what the scriptures have to say. The whole chap of Judaism is that the Torah becomes mine. That it's so much part of who I am that when somebody hears the teaching, they're associated with the person, not just with the, so to speak, abstraction of where that information originates. And that's where we're supposed to get to. We're each supposed to try and get to a point where Torah nikras al shemoy. The Torah is named for me. It's my Torah. It's personal. It's not just something that I know in theory. Let me tell you a story. Now, the unfortunate thing about this story is that I've heard it attributed to different individuals. So for that reason, I'm going to skip the name. In fact, just this week, I came across another version of the story with a different individual. So now there's three possible individuals of who it was. One version that I originally heard was the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad. The second version that I heard was Rebbe Lev Yitzchak of Berditchev. And this week I was reading a book from Rabbi Steinsaltz, or as he changed his name later, Evan Yisrael. And he says that it was actually a student of the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad. So whoever it was, the story is still a good story. The story goes that this individual left home under a cloud of contention because he wanted to go and study with, at that time, Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich. That's the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. He wanted to study the Hasidic method. Came from a very learned family. And that's why there was so much contention. You know, why don't you go to the local yeshiva? You have to go schlep somewhere else and be part of that yeshiva. Anyhow, after some time, he comes back home. And at this point, when he went off to yeshiva, because it was normal in those days, people got married quite young and they'd go study in yeshiva after they were married. So he goes to study in yeshiva, comes back, his father-in-law was seething already. You know, why do you have to do this to my daughter and you have to go so far? And you're learning something which is foreign to us, etc. So he was looking to catch him, So he says, tell me something, what did you learn over there that was so compelling? So he says, I learned that there's a God. You can well imagine that the father-in-law was far from impressed. So he calls over, they had a Russian lady, a peasant woman who was working in their house. So he calls over this lady, obviously not a Jewish woman. He says, tell me something. Who created the heavens and the earth? She says, God. He says, you see, she didn't go to yeshiva. And you ask her, she seems to be very familiar with God. What do you mean you went all this time, all this distance? All you came back, you said you learned this as God. So he said, I'll say it first in the original Yiddish. He says to his father-in-law, Sie sagt, aber ich weiß. She says there's a God, and I know there's a God. What's the difference? Anybody could say that there's a God. We say all kinds of things. We pay lip service to many different ideals. But the reality is, we go on with our lives without necessarily living with those ideals. Very often. And sometimes we are the big experts. We have so much to say, and we've done so much research, and we can tell everybody, and then we go on and we do, whatever it is, ourselves. There's a story that they tell, it's supposedly about Aristotle, who was not only a philosopher, but a big lecturer on morals and ethics, that his students once saw him walking out of a house of ill repute. And they said, Aristotle, my high, as we say in the Gemara, like, what's going on over here? How could you're the leading voice about ethics and morality. You're walking out of such a place? So he says, right now, I'm not Aristotle. In other words, it's so easy for a person to live in an academic reality that doesn't necessarily translate into a real reality. I think that's what frustrates us a lot about today's world. Everybody's talking, campaigning about human rights and equality and all these things, and then they go and support terrorists. How does it make sense? Because you're living in your head. Because you don't have das. That's the difference between saying things and knowing things. The person who says things could very often land up behaving in a way that does not align with the things that they say. The person who knows things, there's no debate, there's no issue. I'll give you an example, right? Very simple example. Yeah. In fact, I'll introduce it with a story which I hope nobody will be offended by. But you ever hear the story of a real Santon Kugel driving here in our streets here in Joburg. She stops at a street corner and there's a guy with a sign. And the sign says, haven't eaten in 3 days. And she says, force yourself, dear. Now, what's the word? What's the word? The word is that when I'm hungry, it's an emergency. And when you're hungry, it's self-growth. You're learning control and, that's the difference between the things that we say and the things that we know. Let's take it from a different perspective. When you look in the mirror, do you have to convince yourself that you exist? And the mirror might lie about all kinds of things. But do you exist? You look in the mirror, you see, I exist. There's certain people in the crowd we have to modify. In today's world, you have to modify. So what's to look in the mirror? When you take a selfie, right? When you take a selfie, do you exist? Of course I exist. I don't say that I exist. I don't have to prove that I exist. I exist. I know it. That's knowledge. Does Hashem exist? I say that Hashem exists. Do I know it? Do I know it in the same way, with the same kind of reality as when I look in the mirror? If I did know it that way, I would never do anything wrong. I'd always be absolutely aligned with what Hashem wants. That's the difference between saying there's a God, knowing there's a God. Da'as is the integration. It is the bonding of an idea to a person. In this particular case, we're going to see that there are various types of bonds that Da'as creates. But first and foremost, it's to bond with the concept. So it's not Kirvas Elokim Toiv. It's not some kind of theory that closeness to Hashem is a good thing. It's Kirvas Elokim Li Toiv. This is good for me. This is important to me. This is a priority for me. This is what's going to drive me. This is what's going to get me out of bed in the morning. This is going to be what I do even on the days that I don't necessarily fulfill all the other things that I feel are so important. That's Da'as. Now, let's take it a step further. Up until this point, our focus was that Da'as takes the idea and makes it mine, which is true. But there's a very important component that you cannot have Da'as unless you have this particular step. And that is, what you know has to be true. It's not possible to have Da'as about something either that is false or that I haven't yet realized is true. Now, why is that? Let's try and understand this. We learned last week. Ein ani ela b'da'as. There's no such thing as poverty except in the realm of da'as, meaning a lack of da'as is poverty. Ve'ein osher ela b'da'as. And there's no such thing as wealth unless a person has da'as. Now, let's understand. What's the big difference? We spoke about this last week. What's the big difference between poor and rich? It's got nothing to do with a bank account. Absolutely nothing. I can't remember who used the line. There are some people so poor that all they have is money. Rich and poor has nothing to do with a bank account, with a bank balance. Nothing at all. Rich and poor has to do with, am I in a position that I'm a giver, because that's wealth? Or am I in a position that I'm a recipient, because that's poverty? So in knowledge, the person who is rich in knowledge is the person who can teach, the person who can explain, the person who can help. The person who is poor in knowledge is the person who's always needing guidance, advice, input, because I don't have the wherewithal on my own to be able to make a decision. In emotion, the person who is wealthy is the person who can share comfort, the person who can be encouraging, the person who can celebrate somebody else's success, somebody else's simcha. Poverty is, I need validation. I need somebody to always to justify my existence. I need to be the one who's winning, otherwise I can't be happy. That's the difference between wealth and poverty, right? It's, am I in a giver or recipient state? So now let's talk about this in terms of concept. Chokhmah. We already touched on this last time. I'm going to develop it further. Chokhmah. Is Chokhmah wealthy or poor? We said last week that it's poor. Why is it poor? Because Chokhmah is waiting for the Chokhmah to happen. You can't elect to have a Chokhmah. In the same way as you can't decide, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to brainstorm for 10 minutes, and at the end of the 10 minutes, we're going to have a good idea. It doesn't work that way, right? You've got to hope that the juices flow. You've got to hope that you have the inspiration. You've got to hope that the muse is there. You need something that's going to help. Chokhmah is not inherently wealthy. Now, Bina, let's analyze Bina because we didn't do this fully last time. Why is Bina not yet wealthy? Bina is so much information. It's research, it's analysis, it's comparison, it's deep diving. Why is it not yet wealthy? Correct, it has that das, and therefore what? It's still external, correct. But remember, external, up until now, we've been speaking about das in terms of li toiv, the relevance to me. I'm introducing a new perspective now, which is, I cannot have das about something until I am satisfied that it is true. Why? So you see, the very nature of research, honest research, is that you have to consider the possibility that there's another perspective. Otherwise, it's not honest research. Then it's just forming a narrative. Honestly, let's say, for example, in a laboratory, right? So we're doing an experiment in a laboratory and we want to see if we modify this particular gene, can we cure that particular disease? So, of course, in order to run this experiment, we have to be looking for that result, right? We would like to be able to cure this disease. We think that this gene is linked to the cause of that disease. So we understand where we're going. Obviously, every project in a science lab has to have a particular destination, a particular objective, of course. But what happens if in the course of our experimentation, we discover something completely unrelated about this gene that's also beneficial to humans? What are we supposed to say? Sorry, that's not what we're looking for right now. So we're going to ignore that. Or do we say, eureka, right? True research is that I'm open to the possibility that there are other views, that there are other opinions, other possibilities. If I'm not willing to do that, I'm not being an academic. If I'm not willing to do that, I am essentially an academic bigot, saying this is the only way that things could work and it has to fit into my narrative. That's not academic. That's not honest. That's not research. That is, as we call it, narrative. So the thing is, that's the negative side, right? The negative side of being focused on one particular thing is I'm not open to other possibilities. But the point is, as long as I'm in the research phase is always open to alternatives. Therefore, I can't yet say, Li, Toiv, this is personal to me, because I don't yet know if this is the final conclusion. So how can I adopt it if I'm not yet sure that this is what I want to adopt? I have to have a sense of clarity. In other words, Das is not only the personalization of information, Das is the clarity of the truth of the information in order for it to be safe to personalize. Does that make sense? And so let's take this from a different perspective. Remember that little graph that we had, the little diagram with the 10 Sephiros? And you'll remember that the 10 Sephiros are in 3 columns. So there's a right-hand column that has in it Chokhmah, and beneath that Chesed, and beneath that Netzach. There's a left-hand column which has Bina, and beneath that Gevura, and beneath that Hoid. And then there's a central column, and the central column is the most populated column because it's got Keser all the way at the top, then it's got Daas, then it's got Tiferes, then it's got Yosoid, and then it's got Malchus all the way at the bottom. So it's the most populated column, and that's not accidental. And of course, remember that this is just an illustration, and illustrations are not the way things actually are. It's just supposed to represent something about it, right? But the point is that right and left represent extremes. The middle represents a sense of either balance and or integration. So let's do it this way. I'm going to skip ahead just to make a point, and then we'll come back. So I'm going to skip ahead to Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes, which we haven't begun to explore so far. But I'm just going to use this as a bit of leverage to help us appreciate the value of that central column. So Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes, we know, are associated with our 3 forefathers. So let's match them up. Chesed is Avraham. That's easy, right? Because Avraham is Isha Chesed, is the kindest person you'd ever meet. He makes this free hotel in the middle of the desert. All you got to do is thank Hashem and you're good. And he's the person who davens on behalf of the rogue nation of Sodom and Amorah. And he's the person who'll do anything to save Lot, even though Lot made very poor decisions in his life. Absolute Chesed. Great. Okay, who's Gevurah? Yitzchak. How do you know? Because Lakeda, here's somebody who has such dedication. Gevurah is strength. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us that true Gevurah, true strength, is self-control. So what's Yitzchak? Yitzchak is somebody when his father says, I'm about to slaughter you on an altar, he's like, okay, just make sure you tie it very well so that I don't flinch. Yitzchak is the person of Gevurah. The other ways that we know that Yitzchak is Gevurah, unlike his father, Yitzchak almost never leaves his home. He certainly is not allowed to leave Israel because Gevurah is restraint, restriction. So he's not allowed to travel beyond certain borders. It's part of the reason why it is that Yitzchak ends up having a son called Esav. Esav is a lot of Gevurah as well. And in Kabbalah we say that Reisha da Esav, the head of Esav, is in the heel of Yitzchak, implying that the nature of Esav is derived from the nature of Yitzchak. It's just that he's got a very toxic kind of Gevurah, a lot of aggression, a lot of violence. So that leaves us with Yaakov is Tiferes. Tiferes, right? What's Tiferes?
The balance.
So Tiferes, it says, Titein emes leYaakov. That Hashem says we give truth or integrity to Yaakov. That's a very powerful statement. What does that mean? Does it mean that Avram is not truth? Does it mean that Yitzchak is not truth? What does it mean that Yaakov is truth? What, are we disparaging the other forefathers? Are we saying that Avram is not truth? How can you say such a thing? So the answer is that to be an extremist, even if you're an extremist in chesed, like Abraham was, is not the ultimate truth of how a person should live. Yeah, Abraham did it because his role in life was chesed. But for us to think that we should be Avram-like and just spew out only chesed, that is not truth. That's not the true way to serve Hashem. On the other extreme, Yitzchak's mission in life is to be the ultimate expression of Gevurah. That's his mission in life. But if any of us were to say we're going to be only extremist to Gevurah, everything's got to be exactly precise, it sounds very demanding and very, both of ourselves and of others, and a little bit OCD. So we say that's not truth either. So Titein emes leYaakov. Where will you find emes? You'll find emes, truth, you'll find in Yaakov, who took all of Abraham's elements, all of Yitzchak's attributes, put them together and became the not balanced, integrated version of the two. Because balance, you know what they say, a balanced diet is? A plate of food in each hand. Balance is unfortunately sometimes what people believe to be a little bit of a watering down of either side, so we can have balance. No, integration means I get the best of both of them and roll them into a new product, which is much more powerful. So you can now understand why Tiferes, which is the attribute of truth, sits in the middle column. Because the middle column, when they built the Mishkan, the walls around the Mishkan had 3 bars that had to run through because remember, it was boards called the Kerushim, and the boards had to be linked together. In order to link them together, there was a pole that had to run on the outside of the boards, and there were little clasps, and then you click them in like Lego, and that's what kept the boards together to form a wall. There were 3 such poles. One of them went inside the boards. And the Torah calls that Habriach HaTichoin, the central beam, Mavriach min HaKotze el HaKotze, which pierced from the one end to the other end, from one extreme to the other extreme. So in Kabbalah we say that the 2 external poles that held the walls together represent Chesed and Gevurah, whereas the one that represents Tiferes, which is Midas Emes, the element of truth and integrity, Mavriach goes right through Min HaKotze el HaKotze, right through everything, because that's the nature of truth. The nature of truth is it's not true today and not tomorrow. And the nature of truth is, as the word represents Emes, Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, Mem is the middle letter of the alphabet, Tov is the last letter of the alphabet. What is truth? What is integrity? It is absolutely consistent from the beginning to the end, regardless of what's happening. So the central beam of the 10 Sephiros are the ones that integrate the different extremes together. Mavriach min HaKotze el HaKotze, that brings together the 2 extremes so that you can have an integrated connection, because that's where things work. Now, why are we doing all of this? Because Das sits on that central beam. So what Tiferes means in terms of integrity, in terms of character, Das is in terms of concept. Das is when I find the integrity of a concept. When I'm no longer still trying to work it out, when I'm no longer still open to suggestions, when I'm no longer unsure of what next question might arise, and that might throw me off. In other words, if, for example, we have an interaction with somebody and they bring up a topic, it could be the question about Hashem's existence, it could be the question about the authenticity of the Torah, etc. If we feel unsure or uncomfortable, we don't want to engage with that kind of conversation, it might be a symptom of the fact that we don't have das yet in that area. Because when I have das, when I truly know the truth of a concept, I am unflappable. You can't scare me. If I'm still in a bina phase, I'm still trying to understand the world, then maybe you're going to ask a question that's going to upend my whole hypothesis, and then I don't know what I'm going to do. Das is, it's become true. Not only has it become real, it's become true. I know there's a God. Like I know that it's daytime outside right now. Nobody could convince me otherwise. You can get a person over here who might be the biggest scientist in the world, who might be the most eloquent person in the world, trying to convince me that it's nighttime. I'm going to look at him and say, you're crazy. Because it's absolutely clear to me that this is day. It's authentic. It's not theoretical. So ein ashir, a person is not wealthy in their position, in their perspective, in their ideology, ela b'das, until they've integrated that ideology. A, that it is personal, and B, that they have absolute clarity that this is true. So das is a really, really advanced state, right? It's a really advanced state. And now we've learned something fascinating about das, because up until now we said das is the link, because remember, ha'adam yoda eschava, that das is the bonding of two separate entities into one, the intimacy. Up until now, we said it's the intimacy between the mind and the heart, between the things we've learned and the things we feel. But now we've learned something else. Das, and if you look even at the image, the way that we represent it diagrammatically, das sits between Chokhmah and Bina. Das is also the bonder of Chokhmah and Bina. It's what takes, because remember, what happens with Chokhmah? How does a person experience Chokhmah? We learned this right at the beginning. How does a person experience Chokhmah? When they let go of themselves, right? That's why it is that when a person's in the shower, they'll have better ideas, or in my case, in the Amidah, they'll have much better ideas than they'll have when they're sitting in a strategy session. Because Chokhmah requires us to let go of self. It's a state of surrender. Bittul. Whereas Bina is very much about self. I need to be proactive. I need to be learning. I need to be assessing. I need to be asking questions. So they're actually two different extremes. Chokhmah is an extreme of letting go, and Bina is an extreme of using our talents. So Das comes along to integrate the two. Because on the one hand, Das is seeking the truth. The truth is not about me, so it's complete acceptance. And on the other hand, it wants that truth to be my truth, so it's all about me. And that's this incredible integration of two very different states, two very different experiences. Okay, let's make this even one step deeper. There's a pasuk, there's a verse that says, Ki keil de'os Hashem. Okay, well, let's focus on the beginning. Ki keil de'os Hashem. God is a God of de'os. Now, in modern Hebrew, de'ot would be opinions. Hashem doesn't have opinions, right? Hashem has an opinion. It's called absolute truth. And yet, this pasuk says that Hashem has de'os, which are perspectives. Or, in our context, different levels of da'as. And so we speak about something that is called da'as elyon, supernal da'as, and something which is called da'as tachton, which is lower da'as. And if we're going to talk about our own development of da'as, we have to recognize the possibility that we could have da'as elyon, a very advanced kind of da'as, or da'as tachton, a very basic kind of da'as. Now, remember, we're going to be talking over here specifically about our knowledge of and relationship with Hashem. Yes, of course, da'as applies in many different areas. A person could have da'as about health, a person could have da'as about money, a person could have da'as about a relationship, etc. Like people often say, how did you know this was the right? I just knew, right? So you could have da'as in many different areas. But we're going to talk specifically right now about our relationship with Hashem. So there's something called da'as elyon. There's a higher perspective. There's something called da'as tachton, a lower perspective. Or knowledge. Knowledge is the better word to use. So before we can do this, it's always easier to start with something that's relatable, right? Relatable. Okay. Let's talk about something that's relatable. Parenting. See? You know what you remind me of? There's the story, 4 Jewish women get together to play cards. So the first one says, oi. So the second one says, oi vey. And the third one says, oi vey izmir. So the fourth lady says, okay, enough about the children, let's play cards. Okay, so when it comes to parenting, there is the perspective of the parent and the perspective of the child. Let's talk about a young child for two reasons. Firstly, because it makes the parable a lot easier to understand, and also because it's less triggering than if we were talking about a teenage or adult child, right? Okay, so we can talk about a little child. So there's the perspective of the parent and there's the perspective of the child. We're going to call them, for the purposes of our metaphor, that the parent has da'as elyon, the parent has the higher perspective, and the child has da'as tachton, the lower perspective. So let's think about this for a second. Let's use an example. So the parent says to the child, when you finish eating, you have to take your dishes, you have to put them in the sink, which is a privilege of living in this country, because in anywhere else in the world, you have to go wash your dishes, right? Our kids think we've just done who knows what to them because told them to put the thing in the... But if they were living elsewhere, okay. So the child says to the parent, why do I always have to be the one who's putting the dishes in the... Okay. So now you've got the da'as elyon and the da'as tachton. You've got the perspective of the parent and the perspective of the child. Please tell me, what is the perspective of the parent? Why does the parent want this child to clean up after themselves? To learn. I would like my child to be a responsible citizen. I would like my child to be able to have skills to deal with the world, because there won't be somebody constantly following them around, picking up after them. So my da'as elyon, I've got this big perspective about life where I want my child to be a resilient, successful human. Okay. So in that moment, in that altercation, should I be saying this? They're saying, here, little Moishi, the reason you've got to put away the dishes is because I have this big vision for you. One day you're going to own your own company, and at that point you're going to have to be able to take responsibility, and now we're sowing the seeds of personal responsibility.
You just say this is not a democracy.
You say, exactly. That's what you say. You say, this is not a democracy. As long as I'm feeding you, you're going to be putting away dishes, right? As long as you're living in this house, as parents might say, right? As long as you're living in this house, these are our rules. One day you have your own house, make your own rules, and then come back and tell me how similar they are to mine. In other words, da'as elyon and da'as tachton, you have to know your audience. Just because I have a much more mature, big picture view does not necessarily mean that that's where the child is. Da'as tachton. The child is in the here and now. Yes, no, must I do I have to do this? Don't I have to do this? Do I want to do it? Don't I want to do it? Etc. Okay, let's plug that into our experience. Da'as tachton, we'll start there because we're familiar with this. Da'as tachton, which is our perspective. In our perspective, is it important for us that the sun should shine? Is it important for us that we should be able to come home and the house is still standing and there's food in the fridge? Is it important for us that when we walk past people, they actually acknowledge that we exist and they say hello? Hello. Of course, that's da'as tachton. Da'as tachton is where we are real. Our struggles are real. Our pleasures are important. So I want to ask you, from Hashem's perspective, when I'm sitting at one of our local kosher restaurants, right? And as I sit down, of course, the table wobbles. And then the waiter comes over and the waiter says, what would you like to order? And I say, what do you recommend? And the waiter says, I recommend whatever it is. And then 2 minutes later comes back from the kitchen to say, I'm sorry, it's not available. Does that bother Hashem?
No.
Right? Da'as elyon. Da'as elyon, Hashem obviously has a much higher, much more advanced, much bigger, infinitely bigger perspective than whether or not the particular item on the menu was or wasn't available when I felt like I wanted it. Can you see there's a clash between da'as elyon and da'as tachton? Of course. Therefore, the Torah tells us, Kel de'ois Hashem. Hashem chooses not only to look at things through his lens, because if he did, none of the things that bother us would ever get resolved. He chooses also to look through the perspective of da'as tachton. And sometimes you have to know, you made us, this is how we feel. And when we're davening for something, Hashem's not going to sit over there on his heavenly throne on Rosh Hashanah and say, that's what you're davening for? There are bigger things at play. He's going to say, I get it. You're a human being. You need this in your life. I'll give you the bracha. So now let's look from our perspective. Das Elyon and Das Tachton. Now that we understand that these two concepts exist, and we understand that we're created in the divine image, and we understand that Das is about firstly appreciating the truth of a concept, and then making that concept personal to me, how would it be different if we achieved just regular Das? I'm talking specifically about our knowledge of Hashem. I know there's a God. Or if we get to the point of Das Elyon, if we had the ultimate da'as of Hashem, how would they look different? So here's the easiest formula to use. Das Tachton says, Lemata yesh ulemaila ayin. You've ever heard the expression that Hashem created the world, yesh may ayin? Yesh means existence. Ayin means nothingness. So Hashem created the world, yesh may ayin, something from nothing. Das Tachton, our perspective is, Lemato yesh, what lives down here on earth is yesh, it's real, it's tangible, look. See? It's real. I can't meditate for 3 hours and then walk through the wall. The wall is real. Lemata yesh. Lemaila, the things that exist in the higher worlds, ayin, they are not tangible, they're not real to me. They're academic material. So of course I know that Hashem exists, and I believe that there are angels, and I believe that there's Gan Eden, and there's life after death, and all these things, 100%. But it's ayin. It's not real in my life. It's conceptual. So I want to know, is it possible for a person to live with dedication to Hashem and His Torah from a perspective of Da'as Tachton? My world is real. Hashem's world I accept in concept, but it's not real to me. Is it possible to do what Hashem wants? Of course it's possible. If it wasn't possible, none of us would ever do what Hashem wants. Sorry, I think we're still in the Das Tachton department, right? But you could still do what Hashem wants. Still possible. Sometimes. And sometimes we won't. Let me say, we have Das. We've integrated the concept. We believe. I believe with full faith and Buna Shalema that the Torah is one, that Hashem is one, and that the Torah will never be changed, that Moshe's prophecy is true. I believe all of that stuff. I believe it. And not to do it, it's Das. It's real for me. But it's real for me in a different way as the hot or cold is real for me. Das Tachton. Most of us, at some point in our lives, will have an experience of Das Tachton, and hopefully we live with it on a regular basis. You want to know what it feels like to be a tzaddik? A tzaddik will live with what's called Da'as Elyon. Da'as Elyon is Lamaila yesh ulamata ayin. The things that are above are real. The things that are below are virtual. Lamaila yesh, the things that are above are real. Lamata ayin, the things that are below are virtual. A tzaddik has a different da'as to anything we could imagine. A tzaddik is not a measure of how many mitzvahs they've done, how many pages of Gemara they've learned, how pious they are, how much self-control they have. It's a different da'as. It's a different truth. They live with a different truth. In their truth, Hashem is absolutely real. This world, negotiable. You use a little example. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, right? A little example. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was poor as a shul mouse, as we say. And his daughter comes desperate one Friday. She says, we don't have any oil in the house to light Shabbos candles. What should we do? So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, without flinching, says, what do we have in the house? She says, we have vinegar. He says, Mi she'omar leshemen v'yadlik, yoyma lechoymetz v'yadlik. The same God who decided that the properties of oil are that they can burn, that oil burns, that same God will decide that vinegar burns. Go light with vinegar. In His world, God is real. The physical world is negotiable. It's ayin, it's not fixed. Hashem is the reality. Therefore, if we have a mitzvah to perform, and that mitzvah requires that we light Shabbos candles, and currently we don't have oil, Okay, mitzvahs are Hashem's domain. You can change the world to suit Hashem's domain. That's Da'as Elyon. That is the higher experience of Da'as. Not only do I know that there's a God, but I know God for real, and everything else is subject to his decisions on a moment-by-moment basis. Therefore, there's nothing in the world that could ever interfere with my relationship, with my observance of Torah and mitzvahs. And therefore, I don't live for me, and therefore I serve Hashem. I live for Hashem, and if he wants me to look after me, I'll do that too. Two totally different experiences of Da'as.
But the spiritual world is the reality.